All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's nice to see some familiar faces and some unfamiliar names, at least. So this is our first speaker event of the year, being held by Effective Altruism at Northeastern. Today, we're really excited to welcome Michelle Graham to speak with us today. She's the Executive Director of the Wild Animal Initiative. She studied physics and philosophy at Oxford University, and now she's doing a PhD in mechanics at University of Virginia, or Virginia Tech, specializing in the movement and behaviors of jumping and flying snakes, which is very cool. Today's talk is titled, What Can and Should We Do to Help Wild Animals? It's going to be about 30 to 40 minutes, the talk from Michelle, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions that come up over the course of the talk, jot them down and reserve them for the Q&A. And if you're one of the people who's shy and doesn't like asking questions, but you have a question anyway, feel free to privately message it to myself or Elif, and we'll be able to ask it on your behalf. All right, without further ado, here's Michelle.
Yeah, and actually, before I start, can I just I don't know, Zoom reactions works for everyone, who already is very familiar with the effective altruism community and concepts, because it affects a little bit how I frame my talk. So if you want a thumbs up that you are versus not. Okay, so it looks like we mostly have people who are familiar with effective altruism and some who are not. I don't think you have to, be in the EA community to be a proponent of wild animal welfare, but it does, certain shared concepts sometimes come up. So I'll try to avoid too much jargon, but some people will notice me hinting at various things that are common with sort of the community values there. All right, is this working? Do you have the view of your own faces as well? Because I sometimes have that problem.
Yep.
Okay, so let me see. If I do that, is that better?
Oh, you're good. Yep.
Okay, cool. Okay, so yeah, I'm Michelle. My PhD is sort of interesting, but has nothing to do with this. So you feel free to ask me questions about that separately, but it won't come up here. But yeah, so as Executive Director at Wild Animal Initiative, we spend a lot of time thinking about our obligations towards wild animals and what we should be doing for them. I'm going to theme this talk around four main questions and spend the majority of my time on the first question, which is, why should we help wild animals? The second question I'll talk about, the next three questions I'll talk about a little bit less, but spend a little bit of time on each of what do humans already do to help wild animals? What more can we be doing to help wild animals? And what is Wild Animal Initiative doing right now? And throughout this talk, I think one common concern that people have about wild animal welfare is fear about people doing things, to, around, with wild animals that are sort of not well thought out. And so I want to preface everything I'm saying by saying, when I talk about helping wild animals, a lot of what I'm asking for at this stage is willingness to research the associated questions, with the assumption that if we look into these questions more, we'll know more about what is and is not possible. So kind of keep in your mind, if you ever start feeling like, wow, that sounds risky, that the main thing I'm asking about or talking about is conducting research to help understand wild animals and to see what's possible in terms of helping improve their lives. And so on that, sort of with that in mind, I think the first important clarification is what exactly I mean by helping wild animals. That first question I said, why should we help wild animals? What do I mean by helping wild animals? And at Wild Animal Initiative, the way we define that goal is that we want to help wild animals live good lives. Of course, there's quite a lot of room in the concept of a good life and what that means, but putting that to one side, what I want to sort of distinguish is this concept of helping wild animals live good lives from two additional concepts that are commonly applied to wild animals, which is a goal of conserving wild animal species or a goal of preserving wild animal spaces. And these three goals are often kind of conflated with each other. And to illustrate how they might be separate, I use the example of our own human species. So you could imagine, and many effective altruist organizations actually do, concern themselves with the preservation of the human species, sort of ensuring that humans continue to exist. But surely that's not, the whole thing, right? You can imagine situations in which the human species continues to exist, but every individual human is having a really terrible time. Maybe it's an oppressive dictatorship, maybe it's a really bad climate we have trouble living in, maybe it's prevalent disease. I don't think you need to be particularly imaginative to come up with these scenarios, because we're living in that situation now where our population is thriving, we're not at risk of extinction, imminently, but there's many things left to be done to try to improve the welfare, the well-being of individual humans. So clearly there's a difference between conserving species and helping individuals within that species live good lives. And then on this other thing, sort of concept that's often applied to wild animals in our society of preserving wild spaces for their benefit, you could imagine that providing every human on this planet with a house and sufficient room to move around might solve a number of problems or issues that cause humans to have bad welfare, but it wouldn't be the sort of end of all charitable work to improve human lives. We would not then be living in the utopia if we just all happened to have housing. So I think there's a difference between these three different concepts, and the one I'm going to be focusing on through the rest of this talk, and what Wild Animal Initiative is on in terms of our work, is helping wild animals live good lives, and working on developing that definition of what it means to live a good life for a wild animal. So one assumption I'm going to make, and not spend too much time on, is that many, if not all, wild animals have the ability to feel good or bad. I think this is sort of relatively uncontroversial, at least for other mammals. I don't think there's many scientists advocating for the idea that other mammals don't have good lives. And as long as you agree with that, I think you can go along with the rest of this talk and just substitute mammals wherever I say wild animals, and a lot of the arguments I'll make still apply. That being said, I think there's decent reasons to assume that even more animals than that have the ability to feel good or bad, sort of have a subjective experience. Definitely fish and birds, probably reptiles and amphibians, and possibly insects and smaller animals and other invertebrates. I think that's definitely a question for research, and the more animals you sort of include in that bucket of animals that have the ability to feel good or feel bad, the more sort of urgent and pressing this problem becomes. So even if we grant me sort of that assumption, there's still some additional questions we might want to explore. So one is that, okay, maybe the wild animals have feelings, but do they actually need our help? If they don't need our help, let's not waste resources on it. If they do have issues that cause them suffering, well, is it our responsibility to provide aid, or should we be doing that? And then is it urgent? So maybe, yes, in theory, it'd be really great if we were helping wild animals, but there's other really pressing problems that unfortunately with our limited resources, we can't dedicate them to this problem. So I'm gonna sort of not really tackle each of those individually, but just give some broader justifications for why all three of these things sort of seem to be true, or the answer seems to be yes for all of them. And so the first of the claims I'm going to make is just, one, there's a lot of wild animals. I don't think that's like a controversial claim, but I think one thing that often gets missed is just the true scale of what that word "a lot" is doing. And so to illustrate that, I just have like some very quick numbers. On a rough order of magnitude scale only, so there's like about 1 billion order of magnitude humans on the planet, and 18.6 billion chickens. So just one population of domestic farmed animal. It's already about twice as many chickens as there are humans on this planet. Then just choosing a particularly populous group of fish, the bristlemouth fish. It's not one species, it's sort of a group of several species, like closely related. There's about 1,000 trillion bristlemouth fish in the ocean. And then if you include ants and sort of the group you consider as having the capacity to have good and bad experiences, there's about 100,000 trillion individual ants possibly on this planet. Those latter two numbers are not amazingly well established because people haven't dedicated that much research to this, but these order of magnitudes are very rough. And so to illustrate, exactly what these numbers mean, because it can be quite difficult to imagine big numbers, if that line representing the human population is about 1 inch long, the line representing the chicken population is roughly 2 inches long, the line representing the Bristlenell fish population would be about 2 miles long, and the line for ants would be something like 200 miles long. So it's just significantly greater scales when we're talking about, and obviously I just chose random, relatively random groups that I was able to find numbers for, but when you start considering the vast numbers of different individual animals and population, it's just the scale is wild. So I think different moral systems place different amounts of weight on how much the scale of a problem matters in terms of numbers of individuals affected. But I think the numbers here are significant enough that even a small percentage of wild animals are not having a good time. That's a lot of individual suffering out there in nature. And I think within the effective altruism framework, with that typically, although not always, emphasizes a consequentialist and utilitarian framework, this sort of counting up, it means that sort of the population of wild animals as a whole, if you can find work that helps improve as many of their lives as possible, you're possibly kind of doing a huge amount of good through that moral framework. So the next claim is like, I think everyone should accept that there are definitely a lot of wild animals, and depending on which ones you include as thinking about can be, have the capacity to feel good or bad. There's maybe more or less of them relative to humans, but definitely loads. And the second claim that you then need to make to think that this problem is really significant and urgent is that a lot of things about life in the wild are unpleasant. So I think there's less evidence in support of this claim, just because there hasn't been as much work dedicated to understanding the exact quality of life of animals in the wild. But that certainly doesn't mean there's none. So I'll just use one illustration, which is looking at causes of death across the animal kingdom. And so this figure is from a paper by Hill and his co-authors in 2019, which was a massive literature review of all the different information they could find about cause of death of wild animals, like animals living in the wild. And so on the left side of this graph, you have the percent of mortality. And on the x-axis, you have different groups. So they've got mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians. You'll notice they did not collect any data on invertebrates. There's not a lot of information about how invertebrates die available. And you'll also notice that within each of these categories, they broke it down into adults and juveniles. And in every case, the juveniles we have less data for than the adults, because generally bigger things are easier to pay attention to. And so each of these colors represents a different kind of cause of death. So on the light yellow, that's total harvest. That's a weird choice they used. It means animals killed by humans. And they say total because it encompasses both legal and illegal hunting. Vehicle collisions is that light pink. Other human causes of death is the light blue. Predation, disease, accident and injury, other natural causes, starvation and malnutrition, and unknown. And so what you can see, first of all, is that predation pretty much dominates the way animals die from what we can tell. Although I will say that even though some of these numbers are fairly big, 14,936 animals across all of the trillions and trillions of animals that exist on our planet is not a huge sample. So, I think we're not, we don't have all the information we would like, but based on the sample we do have available, predation seems to dominate. There's big differences between how adults and juveniles die, and there's a lot of unknowns, but within that, being eaten, being hit by a car, dying from a significant disease, dying from starvation or malnutrition. These are not, fun ways to go. And I think we, in our human population, try to insulate ourselves as much as possible from very painful and very uncomfortable experiences and causes of death. And while obviously death is just one part of an animal's total life, if these are the ways they're dying, these are the things they're having to avoid in their daily life. And if your daily life is mainly made up of trying to avoid being eaten to death, avoid being starved, avoid starving, avoid collisions with vehicles, et cetera, that sounds pretty stressful to me. Of course, I would love more data on exactly how animals experience their environment. I would love more data on, what kinds of experiences are most stressful for animals, so that I don't have to extrapolate from my own experience to that of animals. But I think in the absence of that data, we should not just assume that they don't care, that they are fine, that they're not stressed by these experiences. And another sort of illustration I like to make to help understand, why life in the wild might not be very pleasant for a lot of animals is just sort of a model from what we understand about the way animals reproduce. So let's take the example of say, a mallard duck. Mallard ducks tend to live somewhere between 5 and 10 years. They become reproductively active around 7 months. They have groups of babies each year that range from maybe 8 to 13 ducklings. So if we take a really conservative estimate at the number of ducklings a given pair of ducks will produce over their lifetime, and this is not a perfect model because we don't know for sure that every duck reproduces every year. We know that ducks don't mate for life, so it would be a sort of different combination of every 2 ducks each year. But that being said, this is a rough model. We'd say, okay, so they produce 8 hatchlings and the ducklings in the first year, 8 in the second year, 8 in the third year, and 8 in the fourth year. If their population is not exploding, which we know that the mallard duck population is relatively stable in most areas where they live, only 2 of those babies could possibly survive to reproductive maturity. Otherwise, you would see these exponential population growths because there would be more babies every year than adults, et cetera, growing rapidly. So that means that only 2 of those babies made it to be able to reproduce young of their own, and 30 of those 32 individuals these 2 ducks produced died most likely before they were 7 months of age. So for these juvenile animals who are not even reaching reproductive maturity, their experience of death is going to be a much larger proportion of their total life. And the kinds of things that can kill a juvenile animal and can be getting eaten, can be starving to death, potentially over a long period. They describe many juvenile instances as failure to thrive, or for whatever reason, the animal was not successful in its environment. And so all of these things are likely to cause stress to the juvenile over its short lifetime, and then it has no opportunity to accrue good experiences over its life. So this is a sort of situation where if we were facing a massive infant mortality situation in the human population, even separate from the issue of the social bonds, we don't know how adult animals feel about their children dying, but we at least know that all those infants not having the capacity to have a full life would be viewed as a tragedy. And I think it's reasonable to at least be concerned that the same moral reasoning should apply to wild animals. So with that being said, the combination of lots of wild animals and lots of things about life in the wild being unpleasant, we come to the conclusion that it is at least a reasonable hypothesis that many wild animals are suffering a lot in nature. And that makes it a relatively, an urgent problem to look at, at minimum, start trying to understand more about whether these claims I'm making about what life in the wild is like for wild animals are accurate. And if so, what we should be doing about it. Turning specifically to that question of what we should be doing about it, I think the answer is research, provide assistance, but the objections to doing that are, the first primary objection I see is, okay, it's not our fault. We didn't cause this situation of the way, reproductive models that different animals use that lead to high juvenile mortality. We didn't, create nature. It's natural that animals eat other animals. It's natural that animals get diseases and die. It's natural that some animals starve to death. So that's sort of what I call the not our fault, not my problem objection to working on wild animal welfare. But then the other major objection is that nothing can be done, with a strong sub-objection of you'll make things worse if you try. So I'm going to talk a little bit about objection 1 and the first part of objection 2, and then hold the thought on the you'll make things worse, and I'll come back around to that at the end. So let's first of all, in response to the it's not our fault objection, return to this mortality chart, where actually, quite a bit of mortality of animals in the wild is our fault. And so, I don't want to reduce all of wild animal welfare and all of their lives to just their deaths. But it does turn out that mortality is one of the kinds of animal experiences we have quite a bit of data about. And in the case of adult mammals, 40% of adult mammal mortality appears to be caused by humans. That's a very large amount of animal death attributable to human causes. So even if you don't think we should be working on all these other sort of natural causes of suffering. There's still quite a bit of directly human caused suffering to be concerned about here. So I think that the it's not our fault objection doesn't really go through. And that's especially the case when you add in climate change and add in habitat loss, where obviously we don't know the full welfare consequences of these two like very massive ecosystem level changes. But climate change, as we're already seeing, has the possibility to kind of increase a variety of these different kinds of causes of death, or make some of them more threatening. Habitat loss tends to push animals closer together, which tends to increase the opportunities for disease exchange and make more virulent diseases. So it's very unclear, out of these natural buckets that are these sort of top colors, what percentage of them are also contributed to by human activity. So if you're only concerned with the things that humans do to other animals, I think you should be still concerned about this issue of the experiences of animals living in the wild. But I'll also say I don't really think the not our fault objection goes through, because I don't think it matters. Frankly, if I see someone fall down in the street, I'm going to help them up whether I pushed them over or not. It's not an issue to me whether I caused a problem or not. And I don't think it's an issue to the person or being that is suffering either. I doubt that a squirrel getting hit by a car versus a squirrel starving to death, those two squirrels are contemplating very deeply whether the human is causing a suffering or a human is not causing their suffering. From the animal perspective, they are suffering, and presumably they would prefer to not be suffering. And so I think ultimately this objection is just irrelevant. However, if you disagree with me on that moral standpoint, I think there's still the empirical fact that quite a lot of this is attributable to human changes to our ecosystem and direct human influence on wild animals. So turning then to the objection that nothing can be done, I think sometimes people make this objection because the problem seems too large. And I think that's a little bit unfair. So I think, many people don't believe it's possible to attain a utopia for human society, and yet they still believe that it's worth working on improving human life where we can. And I think the same thing can be said for wild animals. It may be possible that there are aspects of suffering in nature that we cannot do anything about, but that doesn't mean we should do nothing about every aspect of suffering in nature. And I think it's really premature to conclude that nothing can be done, in part because there has never been a widespread societal scientific effort to actually investigate what kinds of things cause wild animals to have bad experiences, what kinds of things cause wild animals to have good experiences, and what can humans do to improve, increase the latter set of things and decrease the former set of things. And I think, further evidence that nothing can be done is a wrong-headed objection is that some things are already being attempted. So that kind of brings me naturally into the second part of my talk, which is what do humans already do to help wild animals? So there are existing groups and movements outside of the wild animal welfare movement within effective altruism that care about animal welfare, want to use science to inform policy, think about our responsibilities toward wild animals critically, and are motivated by wanting to help wild animals live good lives. Some examples of groups that fit those criteria, which are sort of a shared set of principles with the wild animal welfare movement within effective altruism, are conservation groups, animal-specific groups, wildlife rehabilitation, wildlife veterinarians, groups that work to prevent wildlife trafficking and poaching, and groups that provide relief during natural disasters. And I did mention, at the beginning of the talk that sort of conservation is distinct from wild animal welfare. And while that's true, if there are no obvious, there's also, there's many people though who nevertheless pursue conservation goals because they believe it will be impactful for improving the welfare of wild animals. And so to give some specific examples of what might already be done, in people who care for wild animals through rehabilitation, of course, they're not able to provide care to trillions of individuals through individualized medical care. They're still doing something motivated by the goal of helping wild animals. And that's often, not paying attention to whether it's a human fault issue or not. So an example would be the bushfires in Australia a few years ago. Those affected billions of wild animals, and many of those wild animals, not a significant percentage, but many individuals were cared for and their burns were treated by wildlife rehabilitators. Now, was that fire exacerbated by climate change, which is human fault? Possibly, most likely, yes. But even so, even without climate change, even without humans, there would still be forest fires. And it would still be the case that we should try to help burned animals if we can. People who try to work on stopping the illegal wildlife trade, obviously that is a human-caused issue, but the people who work on that do want wild animals to have not experienced the suffering caused by illegal wildlife trade. The One Health movement and paradigm is a public health paradigm that emphasizes the interconnectedness of human health and animal health. And that sort of group, many of the activities they suggest for public health policies might have the consequence of reducing the disease burden on some wild animals, and therefore improving the welfare of those animals. And finally, our humans as a society, we provide quite a lot of protection for animals in so-called, special categories. Like, we might provide bird-safe glass as a legislation that passed in New York City quite recently that's designed to stop birds from flying into buildings. And we did that because there's lots of people who really like birds and don't want them to die, and want to provide protection to them in some way. And so, very endangered animals are another sort of special category of animals that we provide protection for. So it's definitely the case that, there's already widespread activity dedicated towards trying to help wild animals, at least some wild animals, lead good lives. But I think if my discussion about the circumstances of life in the wild sort of suggested anything, hopefully it shows that there's actually quite a lot more causes of suffering out there in nature that we should at least be thinking about how we might be able to address. So that kind of brings me to the third question, which is, what more can we do to help wild animals beside what's already being done? And I think at the moment, the most impactful thing we can do is more research. And the sort of wild animal welfare within the effective altruism community has emphasized some core questions that need to be researched so that we can understand how to start helping wild animals. And that is, which animals have the capacity for good and bad experiences? What are the most significant causes of suffering for wild animals? And by that, I mean those affecting the most animals the most intensely. And how can we intervene responsibly to address these causes of suffering and improve individual lives? And these are, of course, incredibly broad questions that may take a really long time to answer, but in the process of answering them, we will start understanding at least some systems better, more quickly than we have solved the whole problem. So some specific kinds of things we are getting started on now, and that we're very interested in at Wild Animal Initiative, is how do we define and measure well-being? So coming up with some consistent criteria we can measure the things we do in nature against to say whether they're doing good, well, or poorly against that criteria. How do we account for the interactive and systems level effects? So if I try to go help some pigeons, how do I ensure that I'm not making life worse for some doves or something like that? And how do we improve the lives of juvenile animals without causing excessive resource competition? So I think, I hope my example before illustrated why, we haven't really been paying enough attention to the lives of juvenile animals and how to improve those. But obviously, if all 32 of those ducklings were to survive from every pair of mallards in nature, we would have a really big population of mallards that may well have massive consequences for its ecosystem, and maybe the ducks would be starving because they would not have enough resources to go around. So obviously, we need to be thinking critically about how we can give more animals a full life without causing excessive resource competition. And I'd like to also illustrate what hopefully this will someday look like in practice. So I think one key element is having wild animal welfare as a policy goal within various governments and managers of different land resources. So that, for example, the EPA could be incorporating welfare assessments into project approvals. We could be managing our conflicts with animals in ways that promote welfare or at least mitigate harm. And we could be actively creating conditions that foster welfare. So as an example of that, we regularly say, take land that's been damaged by human activity or made toxic in some way and try to rehabilitate it and restore that land into something that can support life. Well, if we're already taking this heavily modified ecosystem and trying to change it to be something better, why don't we have a welfare goal as part of that something better? and be trying to identify characteristics of ecosystems that tend to lead to higher welfare outcomes for the animals in them. And I think those kinds of changes are ways that we could hopefully in the future, when there's enough research to inform these activities, allow wild animal welfare to be incorporated as a policy that can affect larger numbers of individuals than direct care. And some particular projects that we are aiming at doing more quickly, or that we think we're close enough to having enough research to implement soon, include fertility-based population control. So these kinds of activities would help with managing conflicts that humans have with animals. So for example, in the conservation community, there's often quite a lot of emphasis on removing so-called invasive species that are in an area where humans don't want them to be, or where they compromise some kind of conservation goal. And currently, that the solutions that conservationists have for removing those species just involves killing millions or more animals. And I think with fertility-based control, we have the opportunity of decreasing a population in a place we don't want them without directly causing suffering. Another example of where we might use fertility-based population control is in pest control for agricultural pests, or in pest control for household pests like rats or pigeons that people don't want in particular areas, where right now, mostly what we do is bother or kill animals to get them to leave our stuff alone. But we could be trying to use fertility-based methods to just reduce their population sizes so that we have the same outcome, a smaller population that bothers us less, without the harmful mechanism of killing animals or hurting them. We could also start looking into vaccination or treatment for the most prevalent or harmful diseases. I think this is kind of a similar approach to what we do in humans now, where we understand that if you treat one disease, a different one could emerge, but we don't sort of let that stop us from trying to prevent animals from suffering from the diseases we can prevent. And then especially identifying the most painful or most unpleasant illnesses and causes of death or causes of suffering for animals in the wild. Because even, obviously if I get treatment for cancer, I'm not expecting that I will then be immortal. The reason I get treatment is so that I can have a slightly longer life, or hopefully a lot longer life. And so that I can, with the hope that eventually when I do pass away, it's from something less painful. And I think we can try to offer the same thing to wild animals by decreasing the prevalence of the worst causes of death, so that when animals do eventually die, they're dying in ways that cause them less suffering. And so I think now is a good time to go back to that second part of that concern about tractability and about how practical it is to try to actually help animals in nature, and specifically that concern that you'll make things worse. I think the reason this concern comes up is because when you start talking about lots of different kinds of wild animals and natural ecosystems, people recognize right away that this is a huge, problem, that it's a very complex system, and that you'll likely have unpredictable results when you try to do things. And I want to emphasize that while I actually, I take these concerns very seriously, and I think they're important, it's actually just everything is like this. And it's only our artificial sort of separation of issues, other kinds of issues that we work in, into sort of discrete boxes that allow us to ignore the fact that all problems that sort of charitable action or positive work for improving the world fits this same description. So to illustrate what I mean by that, consider, say, eradicating malaria as something we're trying to do for humans. And it's because children get and some adults get very sick from malaria. It causes suffering. It affects a huge number of individual humans. So it's a big problem. And being a big problem, it also is subject to these same issues where even if you ignore animals entirely and only talk about humans, it is absolutely the case that if we eradicate malaria, there will be unanticipated results that we might not even be able to measure. There will be things, it will be effects on how many humans live to what age and what they do with their time. And those things will have knock-on effects for climate change, for criminal justice, for societal effects, for economic effects. There will be all kinds of influences that we don't necessarily have the ability to perfectly model out from this massive change of, say, eradicating malaria. But nobody looks at this and says, well, because of that, let's not eradicate malaria because there's a chance we'll make things worse. So I think I take that same mindset when I respond to these concerns and say that we don't have to fix all of the problem in order to do good. And I think this relates to a point I made earlier about, you don't have to think that a utopia is possible to think it's worthwhile to sort of bite away at a problem. I think that, so taking the case of humans, we don't have to say we're going to reach a utopic society in order to think it's worth working on global health. And similarly, we don't need to think that we're going to solve the entire problem of wild animal welfare to think it's worthwhile to at least work on the parts of it that we can solve. Some systems are less complex than others, is my response to the concern that the system is very complex. I think you can isolate sort of particular populations of animals in particular situations where whatever you're intending to do to help them is expected to have less connections to other parts of the system. And fewer connections means fewer things to model and less unpredictable results. And so if we focus on systems like that, either say island ecosystems or populations that don't have really strong interactions with other communities, there's ways to start doing what we can while trying to improve our understanding of how to predict complex system effects and how to model these things out so that we are able to handle the fact that it's a complex system and predict the results of our actions. And that comes down to the last point about the unpredictable results. And I think it's a combination of research and responsible practices. If you knew for a fact that eradicating malaria in one particular way would lead to some massive, terrible outcome in terms of everyone who you protected from malaria now dies from some horrible hemorrhagic fever that's worse. If you knew that was going to happen, you might hesitate to eradicate malaria. But we have enough research about public health and about human systems to be able to understand, if that were the case and what strategy we could use to avert it. And I think, obviously in the case of wild animals, the research is lagging far behind in terms of our ability to predict these effects. And that's why we need responsible work. But even with quite a lot of research, I think you still need to have good responsible practices in which you model the system as best you can, try to account for as many system level results or unpredictable results as you can, and then set up monitoring so that when things happen, when things go differently than you expected, you're able to track that, see it, and respond. And I think that's an approach that could be used in a variety of different kinds of systems, not just in wild animal welfare. But as I mentioned, I think the research part of this is really, really critical. Because we are behind in terms of understanding wild animal systems to the extent that we understand human systems. And so that brings me to my final point, which is, what is Wild Animal Initiative doing right now? And so for a little background on our organization, our goal is to help as many animals as possible of any type live as good lives as possible. And I say of any type, I mean, obviously our focus is on wild animals rather than captive animals, but we don't restrict ourselves into say, okay, it's only mammals, it's only this particular species, it's only endangered species or whatever. We're looking to help as many animals as possible, whichever ones, have the capacity to feel good and bad. And where we don't know which ones have the capacity to feel good and bad, we would love to research that question and learn more. And as I mentioned throughout, this has all been about welfare, but what exactly is welfare? That's somewhat debated, but the definition sort of we use is affective state. So if your own affective state is sort of the subjective sense of how you are feeling at this precise moment. And so we're trying to make it so that animals have more amounts of time in their life where they're feeling good and pleasant, and less amounts of time in their life where they're feeling unhappy and bad. And our particular focus is on launching a research field to address all the different kinds of empirical uncertainties I sort of mentioned throughout this talk. And our specific current activities are divided into two major categories, the first of which is meta research. So we're trying to understand what our funding priorities should be, what types of research are most impactful for moving forward this whole discipline of wild animal welfare research. And then we also work on supporting scientists and other researchers who want to pursue these questions with their career. And so you kind of need three things for a research field to thrive. They need money, the scientists need money for their work. They need a community to have collaborators to work with and people to bounce ideas off of, and they need somewhere to publish their work. And so we're mainly working on items 1 and 2 right now, working to help scientists identify places where they can go for funding for this kind of research and providing some of that funding ourselves. And we also try to provide a community. So right now we're working with a group of postdoctoral candidates to kind of develop some offerings for postdocs, for example, and are building up towards having a conference for wild animal welfare that's annual. We're not currently working too much on publishing venues, but hope to eventually start approaching that in the future. And with that, I would like to just mention quickly that we are hiring. I don't know if anyone here would be a candidate. We're looking for someone with management experience. It's probably 5 years or so of that. But if you know someone who would like to help work with us on these problems, you can forward them this link, or if you're someone like that, feel free to talk to me about it. But with that, that's basically everything I had to say.
Great. Well, thanks so much. That was really good. So I think we can open up for Q&A. If you have a question, just type RTS in the chat, and we can keep an order going. I want to ask my question first. I wanted to know what types of roles or how can people get involved in working on wild animal welfare. So, you know, we might have some life science students in the room today, but also loads of non-life science students. What roles are there?
Yeah, so I mean, there's definitely a ton of opportunity for scientists to start pursuing these questions. So I think historically, you know, if you look at fields that kind of relate to wild animals that already exist, there's sort of animal welfare science that almost exclusively focuses on captive animals, but has developed some tools for analyzing, you know, animal well-being and measuring that and thinking about ways to do it. There's ecology, and that is animal focused, sort of fish and wildlife sciences, which is sort of management focused. Any of these disciplines, if you can kind of find ways to bring them together, you're like one step closer to doing something that is getting closer to wild animal welfare as a science. So for example, in my postdoc working group that I'm working with right now, I have a climate scientist who her whole PhD so far has been on climate modeling, but she has a separate personal interest in animal welfare. And so what we're trying to find her is some set of two sort of principal investigators who can help her kind of continue her climate modeling career, but find ways to extend that over to predicting what the consequences will be. So let's take the example of Southern Ocean warming that she might model, like, okay, we're gonna have this outcome under this climate scenario. How do I actually anticipate what the effects are for like fish in living in that ocean? And she's probably gonna have to choose something a little more specific than fish, you know, like a particular fish maybe, or some group of fish that share some sort of biological characteristics, physiological characteristics. But I think you can, you know, there's lots of people who kind of know about the second half of that and know about the first half of that, either the climate side or the physiological response to those changes, and finding ways to bring them together is really impactful. So I think, you know, the earlier you start thinking about that in your academic career, the more you can try to be like, ooh, I'm going to pull in this thing from animal welfare and this thing from ecology, and keep, you know, you're going to just develop really good skills. But if you're already later in your academic career, then there's still ways to kind of just add in some additional element. And a lot of what I do in terms of talking to people in that position who have some amount of skill in some area and want to add in the animal welfare part is figuring out how we can design a project that makes the best use of their existing skills, but still advances something relevant to wild animal welfare. So huge emphasis on that. The more people we can get excited about doing that, I mean, obviously funding is always a question, and we're actively working on trying to secure more funding and identify more funders who are willing to sort of, and working on figuring out how do you actually phrase this in a way that is compelling to a variety of funders, because there's lots of, you know, there's animal welfare angles, there's science angles. I mean, there's like a lot of just pure intellectual merit to these questions because they just haven't been investigated. So I think there's a lot of room for different kinds of funders being interested in these things, and we're actively working at Wild Animal Initiative on identifying who they are, as well as getting our own funding that we can provide. So I hope I can say that, you know, we're going to grow that pool and have more opportunities for people so that everyone who's interested can join. But you know, of course, at this time, I'm not positive like how the funding to number of people interested ratio will go. That being said, I think there are a few organizations working on wild animal welfare, specifically with an EA mindset. So that's Wild Animal Initiative. There's a little bit of work being done at it at Rethink Priorities. There's some work being done on it in animal ethics. All of us are somewhat funding constrained. So this is one situation where if you just want to like, choose a career where you make a ton of money and donate it to us, like, not going to say no to that. So I think there's a lot of different options for ways to contribute. I think you could also pursue a career in any of the different kinds of organizations I mentioned as having some degree of overlap with wild animal welfare, but know that their value set is not going to be completely aligned with this model. And think about, whether that's something you're comfortable with. If like you're gung-ho this stuff and you go to work, say, at American Bird Conservancy, they're not going to have the exact same attitudes, but you can still look for opportunities within that area to work on the parts of their work that are most likely to, say, improve the welfare of a really large number of wild birds. So those are things that come to mind most quickly.
Great, no, that was pretty comprehensive. Mac?
Yeah, hi. First of all, thank you so much for this talk. This was really interesting and I enjoyed it a lot. So I have a question kind of related to the tractability question and the question of how much of this is our fault. So sort of an immediate thought that I had when you were talking about how a lot of the suffering and deaths of wild animals is caused by hunting is the thought that if we tell people like, you shouldn't hunt because it's bad for wild animals, they'll instead buy meat from farm domestic animals. And I know this is kind of a specific question, so it's okay if you don't have an answer, but do you have thoughts on like whether or not we might think one of those is preferable, like whether it might make sense to wait for like a hopeful end to domestic animal agriculture before we focus on whether or not we should end hunting, or if we think it's preferable to end hunting before we end domestic animal agriculture?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the critical things to think about is, and one of the issues I didn't have time to really get into when looking at that cause of death worksheet is like, I think I had let me bring up a specific example actually. So, we don't actually know like which of these causes of death is most unpleasant to go through, right? And so if you care about the sort of active experience of suffering, you care, and that like, okay, so all animals are going to die eventually, right? We haven't come up with immortality yet. So, let's take the example of New Zealand sea lions. One of the pieces of data that was cited in this review says that 18% of New Zealand sea lions die from tuberculosis, while 24% die as a result from violence from other sea lions. So like, to first know what I want to do about that, I got to know if dying from violence from other sea lions is like more bad than tuberculosis or what. Like tuberculosis might take a really long time to kill you, and where you're having like kind of a suboptimal existence the whole time, or maybe it doesn't, maybe it kills quickly. Like I'm not an infectious disease expert, so that's not my area. But like, I think these are the kinds of things that to even approach the question of like, okay, what is the suffering of an animal on a farm versus an animal in the wild, I need to like know a lot more data about what's worth doing. But I think a rut that sort of this kind of is really common. I don't mean to say this is like this is something you're doing. I think this is a very common rut that effective altruist thinking gets into, is like thinking about everything in terms of the way it is now, the system it is now, and only having like one lever at a time to move instead of trying to come up with synthesis positions. So I think the most obvious thing to do in the case of, okay, it causes animal suffering to have factory farms, and it causes animal suffering to shoot animals. How do we, we can't work on that one because this one goes up. We can't work on this one because that one goes up. It's like, let's not do either, So I think if I think this relates back to the point I made about all cause areas are interrelated. Like you cannot deal with criminal justice, global health, some other aspect of humans without expecting that's going to have some consequences for climate change, for human movements, for immigration reform. Like these things all interact with each other. I think the more alliance building that we can like have between different movements, the more effective we'll all be. And so I think I really encourage people who care about wild animal stuff to also care about what happens to animals in the farmed environment, and think about when you look for projects to do, don't advocate for your wild animal welfare system by saying you should do this and ignore that other problem. It's, hey, we're causing animal suffering in not just this way, but also that way, and let's stop doing both. And so I think it's definitely, if I had to only work on one thing at a time and know that the system was just going to respond to correct that in some other way, I'm more limited in my options than if I like recognize that we can pursue activities that seem most promising for reducing both of these things at once. And I'm not saying I can provide immediately what that thing is, but it's worth looking at, rather than saying like, this is the system, it's fixed, I can only move these levers. It's how does the system interact, and how can I change the way those interactions actually come together?
And Claire.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. And so my question, so is that, so predation was the largest on the slide of all the animal death causes. Predation was the largest source of animal suffering / death on the slide. So I'm wondering like what that means. Does that mean that like wild animal welfare proponents want to like, stop or alter natural predation patterns? And if so, like how exactly would that occur without causing, other negative impacts or, causing lots of other effects? I'm wondering, I don't know what the opinion is on that.
Yeah, I would say that attitudes are really mixed. I do think there's some people who think that because it's the thing that affects the most animals, it's the thing we should be like focusing on. That being said, still back to the point about we don't know which of these things causes the most suffering. I mean, predation is like a huge category. There's probably some ways of getting eaten that really, really, really suck, and some ways of getting eaten that are really fast and relatively painless. So just as an illustration, I've watched a snake eat a mouse. That takes a long time. It takes a really long time, and the mouse is not having a good time through the entire period that it's happening. I'm talking about when they suffocate them, not when they die from venom. On the other hand, I have seen my dog unfortunately has killed a gopher before, and it was like 2 seconds. It like took absolutely no time, and she broke its neck, and it was just really fast. So like comparatively, these two things are wildly different in terms of their amount of suffering that they cause an animal. Again, for juveniles, that experience is a much larger proportion of their total life. So I'm probably more worried about juveniles than other situations. But as I mentioned, we don't really know how to deal with the fact that if you keep juveniles alive, you're going to have lots of different population level effects. So I think this goes back to my first point, or one of the points I made, which is that you don't have to tackle the whole problem to still be doing something meaningful. Even if we tackle exclusively the 40% of mammalian deaths that are human caused and nothing else, that's like trillions of animals. That's like a huge number of animals who might be living better lives, right? So, or at least living a little bit longer and having more time to accrue positive experiences. So that's one thing. And then another thing is just, I think we need to understand more about how predation and various types of predation compare. And then even then, once we've done the research to say, okay, these types of predation are really, really unpleasant, what do we do? What is the problem of snakes and how do we solve it? I think that is then a further research question, because it's not like we just hate snakes now. Like snakes themselves are individuals. It's not their fault they evolved to eat that way, So I think the answer is more research, and we might come to the conclusion where with enough research, some people are like, I think we could safely, fertility control snakes out of existence, and we've done a ton of research on it and we know what would happen, and I think it's like that's going to have the best outcome and I want to do it. Other people are going to respond to that exact same data and say, I don't think that's ethical. Like, I don't think it's ever okay to, eliminate a species. I'm not like sitting here as executive director at Wild Animals Division. I know what the right answer is to that question. Like, I think, first of all, we have to do a lot of research to see even what the options are. And then as a community, we kind of need to come together to do our best thinking about like, this really sucks that this is the way nature works right now. Like, what do we do? And I come up with what we're trying to work towards and what's worth doing. And I think I don't think we have the best models for collective ethical decision making. I think we need to start making them because we have a lot of collective ethical problems. And hopefully, we'll have made progress on that front by the time we even have any idea of what to do about predation. So the really short answer to your question is no one is working on it directly right now. Everyone wants more research. Long answer was the rest of that.
Lexi.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was really great. So I think that there's one objection that I feel like I could see coming up. I'm not really sure if I think it's a strong enough objection, but it seems like the fact that we can't communicate with animals poses like a consent problem. Like, how do we do research to figure out how to help the animals, like without them like volunteering for research or somehow interfering in some way? And even beyond the research, like I'd say that a lot of us are like hold the mindset that it's not right to help a community that doesn't want your help. So how like the animals can't ask for help, they can't tell us that they want it or that they don't want it. Like how do we like reason with that?
No, I think that's a really like, I wouldn't say objection, but concern, like a very important one to include in your research. What I like to respond to that though is to flip it on its head, which is that because animals can't communicate to us, they also can't consent to not receiving our help. So we have this dual problem. It's not you know, with people who can communicate with you, you have a very clear situation where you can fail to ask for help, in which case, or sorry, fail to ask for consent, in which you've done something wrong. You can ask for consent and not get it, and then to act, and then you've definitely done something wrong. Or you can ask for consent and receive it, and you have sort of these three options where you can respond, you know, to the desires of the individual or community you're working with. I think, you know, a very complicated issue that we already face that has some similar elements is fully isolated communities that have no interaction with, say, like many parts of the rest of the world. So like island nations or nations in the Amazon that are very, very, very isolated from humans. You know, I think the international consensus for many of these groups has been like, do not bother them at all. And there's lots of good reasons why, like, even if you thought they might, I mean, first of all, many of these communities like sort of have clearly indicate in various ways that they do not want us to like approach them. But others, you know, another reason is just we know we've got tons of diseases that we would carry to them if we came in contact with them. So there's like a variety of considerations, but we have some, but given that they don't know what they're opting out of, you could argue that in the same way, these communities don't really have, they can consent, but they can't do a fully informed consent in terms of, you know, do they want to integrate with the wider world or not? Because they don't know what they're saying yes or no to, because they don't know what the wider world is like. And I think I think that's thorny, you know, I think it's thorny. I don't have a perfect answer to it. And I think the same thing is true of animals, where, you know, we have no idea how we could communicate to animals what they are saying yes or no to. And so I think what we generally do, for example, with our pets, where we don't think they have the capacity to understand what they're saying yes or no to, is ask instead of consent for assent. So in the case of a dog, for example, you know, if I take my dog to the vet, I try to practice like really high welfare, like veterinary interactions. And so I don't force my dog. I don't hold her still to get her to accept a shot or accept an exam. I use treats so that she has the ability to come towards the vet and accept a treat, and knowing, you know, at this point, she knows what happens when she goes to the vet. So she kind of knows what's going on and whether the treat is worth it for her. And she can dissent and move herself away from a situation or growl or otherwise indicate to me that she does not like what's happening. And so we, you know, I'm never going to get to the stage where she can do fully informed consent, but I can create situations where I can offer her, you know, the ability to indicate to me what she assents to or dissents from. And we're definitely not in the place where we have as much ability to do the same for wild animals, but we can try to do more of that. We can try to do more understanding of the ways animals indicate preferences, more of an understanding of the way animals indicate, you know, pleasure and enjoyment, or displeasure and disenjoyment. And at a certain point, you do need to make a little bit of a leap of faith that no organism that has the ability to sort of, you know, have a subjective experience prefers to suffer. Like maybe, you know, that's kind of the best you can do. You cannot, you know, we're never maybe, and then when we offer ways of helping, we can try to do our best to identify ways where we are learning from the animal what they want. I think, you know, some of this is, we may reach limits to this. I think we should try to do it as much as possible. We may obviously still hit points where we're up against a situation where it just seems like the right thing to do, we have no idea whether the thing that is most welfare promoting, we have no idea if the animal would want it or not. I think that's another thorny ethical question I'd love to sort of sort out with everyone. But I do want to emphasize that the lack of ability to consent is very different in that they can't consent to either situation. They cannot consent to having it done. They cannot consent to not having it done because they don't understand either side. And so it's not quite the same as just not having consent from an individual who in theory could consent. So that's kind of what I want to distinguish.
Romy.
Yeah, hi, thank you for your talk. I never considered like this topic before. So my thought that I had was, so as long as there exists like extreme human suffering and there exists resources to like send aid to any cause we want, like I feel like there's a intuition to like help ourselves before we help others, or like help your own family before you help a stranger. I'm not sure if that intuition is like morally justified or if it's speciesism. But what would be your response to that intuition?
Yeah, so I mean, I think your moral framework, people's moral frameworks tend to differ. And there are people who, they're always going to find it more morally compelling to help their family member before they help someone on the other side of the world. I think the common request I make of people in that situation is to analyze what the basis of that differentiation is. And what do you think is the correct way to guide action? And what would you want other people to do when considering you? So, I think against the argument that you should help your own family before you help people. I mean, I think there might be instrumental reasons to do that because maybe you know what your own family needs best, or maybe you have the most familiarity with that and you're more likely to do the right thing. But in general, is your family member worth more in an objective sense than some other person in a different part of the world? And if so, why? And if what you think morality is doing is just sort of trying to make your own little community as good as possible, well, maybe that's your reason. Like, these other people aren't in my community, and what I'm trying to do with my morality is this. But if what you think you're doing with your morality is trying to make the world as good a place as possible, which is what I'm trying to do with mine, that's just my personal thing. Everyone's got their thing, but that's mine. I can't see any objective reason why my dad matters any more than someone else's dad in Malaysia, some other country that's distant from me or that I've never been to. That dad has relationships and people care about him. That dad has the capacity to have feelings and thoughts. That dad has the ability to suffer. And as much as it would really suck for me personally if I had to choose between helping my dad and someone else's dad, well, in that case, maybe it's even and my personal preferences, overweigh. But if I can help two other people's dads at the mild expense of my own dad, I'm putting out more good into the world than I would be if I only helped my own dad. So I think that's the situation we end up in. And when you then look at animals compared to humans more broadly, you face the same situation, which is, why do humans matter more to you than animals do? Is it that you think that all your, what your morality is for is improving the well-being of the human community, and these other things are just totally irrelevant to your morality? I would ask why. I mean, I think what the purpose is of morality is to try to make the community as good a place as possible. And I would hate it if an alien race came along and had massive technological advantages over us and the ability to cure all our diseases and make us live 100 more years and have no strife anymore. And they were like, well, they're just humans, so we're not going to help them. They're not our species. They're not our population. I think they were dicks, So I think that's kind of the reasoning I apply to myself, which is, I don't want aliens to treat me that way. And so me, as the alien to all these other animals, I want to know, what their capacities are. And if they can feel suffering, I don't weigh that suffering less just because it's a being that's different from me. I think, we have the same obligation to kind of extend our technological capabilities to others if we can do our best to understand them and what they need.
Colta, I think.
Yeah, I guess I had a question about animals that are more, interlinked with human-built environments or human communities. Say pigeons who live on the streets of Boston, or populations of deer that live off of human trash. do you think that these animals are worthy of consideration under your group's mission? And I guess, how would you prioritize their welfare when they're so intertwined with human behaviors and environments?
Yeah, we kind of define wild animal as non-captive animal. So even though pigeons are feral, we include those in our mission, definitely. And so I think they're a better candidate, honestly, for activity sooner than animals in more natural environments, because often they have more limited like food web interactions that mean like changing slightly the population structure or dynamics of a particular pigeon population is less likely to have all these unpredictable knock-on effects to other animals. Of course, there are still animals, there's still some, but usually there's it's a little bit more controlled. It's also a more modified ecosystem where we're already doing tons to like landscape our own environments in our cities. And that means there's lots of opportunity to try to incorporate welfare considerations into those changes, so that, for example, when you build new buildings, let's build them with bird safe glass. Why wouldn't you? You can do these kinds of things where, all right, lots of people oppose modifying fully natural ecosystems. Nobody opposes modifying urban ecosystems. They're already modified from what we perceive as natural. So I think there's quite a lot of room to do good for animals in those situations. So like one example that we're researching now is fertility control for pigeons, where there is a product on the market that's available for them. And we don't know exactly what its effects are. And so right now, pigeon populations are mainly controlled by like bothering them a lot. And people like, there's this like substance that pest control people put out that it's not supposed to kill them on the label, but often it does kill them, and gives them seizures, and tries to scare them away by having some of the birds have seizures and the other birds are freaked out and they move. Like, this is like not a very humane way of dealing with this, but others put up like barriers like spikes and nets, but then the pigeons get caught in the nets and then they die. And so there's like not great methods that people use to keep pigeons off their buildings right now. And so if the pigeon population was just slightly less, you might have two good effects. You might have fewer pigeons competing for resources. So you can find a sustainable population level that would be your target, where no pigeon is starving to death. And then also fewer pigeons would mean less pigeons creating conflicts with humans that make the humans want to hurt them. And if we're able, and so those two possible benefits have to be weighed against whatever the costs of using this drug are. And no one has really done a welfare study of the direct effects of the drugs on the pigeons. So we're trying to conduct that study now. And what we'd end up with is a much better understanding of like, okay, these are the welfare costs of this drug. Maybe there's none, maybe there's some. These are the costs of the current method of using fertility control, of methods of preventing pigeons from bothering us. And the current, side effects of pigeon populations, mainly being not controlled by predation, but by in the urban environment. As far as we know, they're most like juvenile pigeons are mostly constrained by resource access. Don't have a huge amount of good data there, but some. So with those two things in hand, with those various things in hand, we can kind of then make a prediction about whether it would be higher welfare for cities to implement population control methods for pigeons using fertility control compared to what's currently going on, and like advocate for that. So hope that answers your question.
Jacob.
Hi, thank you for this talk. I've sort of played with this idea mostly in conversation when I'm talking about EA. So it was interesting to sort of hear all the data come together in one place. I'm convinced that this is a worthy sort of research program, but I'm wondering whether, because you raised that there's like some areas seem to have much more serious tractability issues than others. So like the snake seems like one where we're really unsure about how we could possibly, I imagine, like affect the ecosystem for the better without affecting the snakes for the worse. And I guess I'm seeing that like the human involved ones are, you like nailed it. Those appeal to me, but they also seem much more tractable. So I guess I'm wondering whether there's like a sense.
Oh no.
Oh, that's the worst. Hopefully we'll get Jacob back. Someone have a question in the meanwhile while we figure out what happened to Jacob? I've got one. So Michelle, we didn't really get to speak very much, or it didn't get covered in your talk about sort of like invertebrates or insects. What types of things do we do, or like what types of things do we think cause insects and invertebrates to suffer?
Great question. So we have way less data on how insects die, let alone what the quality of their life is like throughout. And we have way less data on insect neuroscience. I mean, we know some of the things about like the way their brain is constructed, everything like that. And they have these sort of clusters of neurons and things like that rather than the central brain. But we don't know a lot about what their sort of day-to-day is like and what it is like to be an insect. So, you know, I think it would be pretty premature to make any really wide claims about insects in the wild, at least with the kind of most obvious thing we could try to do most quickly for insects is stop killing them en masse with poison, which is what we do in agricultural contexts. And there's lots of other reasons to reduce our pesticide use. So I think there are some other side benefits of pursuing this program. But I think the reason this is relatively promising is that, you know, okay, we don't know for sure that they're sentient, but this use of fertility control for reducing insect populations in agricultural contexts is already happening, already has some financial support behind it. And if we sort of can align some extra incentives, it might be really cost effective to affect a wide number of insect lives by making these things these strategies take off more. And you know, so with like a relatively small amount of resources, you can kind of cover your back on the issue of insects, where it kind of guard against the worst outcome, which is that they're like as sentient as, or at least some of them are as sentient as your average dog, and we're killing them all, huge trillions and trillions of them en masse every year. So Oxitec is a company that is currently working on these. They use CRISPR to create versions of pest insects that can't reproduce, or like they reproduce one generation and then die. And by kind of flooding the ecosystem with those bugs, you kind of get one generation of them and then out. And because all of the non-CRISPR edited insects are like mating with the CRISPR edited ones, they kind of waste their mating event and don't have reproductive outcomes, don't have babies either. And then, so you just end up with a whole population decline. Now, this is not a gene drive because you're not releasing a gene that is going to continue in the ecosystem. It's a one-off edited gene. The gene edited animals go out, they die. It's called Oxitec. And so what you end up with is you have to continually kind of release the pest, because if you release it in one area and they come in from somewhere else, you got to release more. And we've actually already done this, and many people aren't aware of this. The screwworm was a bovine pest it's like the larva of some kind of fly, and it gets like in eyes, I think. I creeps me out, so I didn't look too much into exactly what happens, but it sounds like a pretty painful death. And like a huge amount of deer mortality in the US was due to screwworm infestation. And the cattle ranchers, it was costing them a ton of money because calves were being harmed by these screwworms. And so they were like to the USDA, let's get rid of them. And like, without modeling the effects or predicting what would happen at all, we just release irradiated larvae of these. So we didn't use CRISPR in this case, we used radiation, but we were able to do the same thing, create sterile versions of the same insect, release them en masse, and they just crash the population. Hopefully, I think without really any real welfare costs, because all that's happening is some bugs are mating and they're not reproducing. So they live the rest of their natural life and then they die, but we're not like poisoning them or killing them in any way. I don't know obviously what the effects of the radiation on the bugs are. I think the CRISPR is probably better, but these radiated larvae are being raised with like plentiful food and then released to what is now, I think Panama is the border. Like we've pushed the screwworm all the way down to Panama. And at that border where they're kind of coming in, that we continually, to this day, release these irradiated screwworms to ensure that north of that border, I'm not positive I got the exact border right, but north of that border, there are no screwworms anymore. And this was not intended to be a wild animal welfare effort, but it just like probably worked. I think we're trying to fund someone to do a retrospective analysis of the wild animal welfare consequences to see what they are in whole. But like, you know, you used to see, apparently, anecdotally from this article I read about, you used to see like monkeys fall out of the trees with just like screwworms eating their eyes. And it's just like, that just doesn't happen anymore in the wild because we've eradicated this pest. And, you know, I care about the screwworms too, but like, we didn't, you know, we didn't smush them, we didn't poison them, we just like gradually bred them out, and some of them still exist, and this borderline that we maintain, and we feed them really well and you know, release them, and they have a life, and then they die. You know, it's like kind of best outcome. So I think there are definitely things with fertility control that we can do to control pest insects where we're reasonably certain the outcomes will be beneficial. We're reasonably certain that it won't cause too much suffering to the insects themselves, or at least is better than poisoning them. And that seems sort of reasonably likely to be worth doing even in the face of uncertainty about what insects actually experience.
Cool, we go back to Jacob, who was convinced on human-related things, but something else, and then he cut off.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was on my phone and it died. So this actually, it sounded like what you were just saying might have like tied in with that. I guess I was wondering whether, as a research project, there's like a range, like certain levels where you would be like really interested in studying this based on its tractability or less. I guess I have this sort of pessimistic intuition, which is probably wrong. My intuitions are terrible, but it's that like many of the suffering situations in ecosystems are going to be such that we can't really improve them much without making some other sort of thing go wrong in the ecosystems, like a Pareto level thing there. And that might just be because I have some like nature is already doing fine on its own intuition or something. But I sort of feel like I would be more interested in studying the human related one specifically because it seems more tractable. And I'm wondering if there's like if you guys would agree with that or not, I guess.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the reason like half of what I put as what Wild Animal Initiative does now is meta research is because we're specifically want to investigate on what basis should we be prioritizing different things. It's like, imagine if you ask someone at the very advent of like, you know, the germ theory of health, like what should we research now to improve human health? It's like, it's like very early days to know what is going to be the most tractable thing or the most impactful thing to research. And it's like, we should just assume that we're going to pursue some research avenues that just like don't return much benefit. And we won't know until we go down them a certain way and we just hit some problem that we can't solve. And then there's going to be other things, and like this has happened in the history of human science as well, where like you hit something and people bump their head against it for a really, really long time, and then like boom, some random technological advance comes in from the side, and all of a sudden you can leap forward a huge amount. So I think, you know, it's going to have the same pitfalls as any research field, which is like you're not going to be perfect and you're going to waste some money. This is one reason why I'm doing my best to identify funding avenues for this kind of work that come out of mainstream scientific funding that are already like pursuing lots of different kinds of research projects, some of which are good and some of which probably are wasting our time. I think, you know, we're trying to not say, for example, get all of our funding for research for wild animal welfare from the farmed animal community, right? Like the farmed animal community already knows what they're trying to do. They've got some clear-cut problem to solve. We should keep giving money to that, definitely. You know, it's just, let's take this money that we already have lots of for science and spend some of it on science around wild animals. But yeah, I think we have been focusing, we kind of have this prioritization scheme that we kind of use roughly for now, which is this project likely to be publishable? And that one is at the top because what we're really trying to do is get more people interested in doing this work. And we need some press, you know, we need some attention to the area. And so it's kind of first, not what is most helpful for wild animals, but what is most likely to get more scientists involved, with the expectation that more scientists getting involved will help more wild animals down the line. But then also what's most likely to sort of not be wildly controversial, not be really confusing, you know, be likely to be implementable relatively soon, because those are things where once we get some of those projects done, we can dig into those other thorny questions like what do you do about predation, where You know, we do not want our reputation to just be these are the people who are trying to end predation. We don't know that we're trying to do that yet. We have a lot of research to do before we have any idea whether or not that's a good idea or possible. So we want to be able to have some things to point to that are like, these are just like straightforward things where you can be pretty reasonably certain that like we can do some good here with this. And we're trying to identify what those things are and get them implemented.
Can I ask like a really quick follow-up, Colleen? It's just, I was wondering whether, just as another sort of place where tractability or maybe just impact would be interesting, is I'm sure that you're interested in overlap. You talked about overlap a lot. It seems like some overlap areas like biodiversity concerns and like climate change research and things like that would really tie in with this. Do you think there's a like a feeling that you might, I mean, look, this is like, it's basic. We're going to go down research programs that are not going to pay out. I agree, but I'm wondering if there's like, if you want to tie this to climate change research and other kinds of, I don't know, it's mostly climate change research that I can think of right now. But like, or if you want to kind of keep it separate when you're doing this impact, and then if it happens to work, then we can talk about, you know, doing both at once.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of so inherently interdisciplinary that it doesn't really make sense to try to excessively delineate it from the gate. I think the one thing we do try to do is just make these distinctions, because the problem is so many people have this model of our relationship to wild animals that is exclusively based on habitat preservation or biodiversity conservation, that you just talk about this and they just jump to that. And so I do like to be very clear that these are different things. That being said, there's no reason that there wouldn't be some elements, you know, of overlap or shared ground. And I think particularly what we're interested in is just inserting concern about welfare into some other disciplines where there are already people who care about it, but just haven't been necessarily thinking about it as tied. So like in my example of a climate researcher before, where she cared about animals in general in her life and did climate research in her job, and now is thinking, oh wow, I can actually pull those things together. That's kind of the jump we're trying to make, where, you know, we already have funding for climate science, we already have funding for biodiversity research, so let's get people concerned about welfare in it. And within conservation in particular, there's been more of a movement to talk about animal welfare with some, you know, mixed success, where some people are very offended by the idea that you would ever compromise on a conservation objective at all for a welfare outcome. And other people are like, why would you ever kill an animal for a conservation outcome? So you got kind of really diametrically opposed positions on that. And trying to encourage people to at least find some common ground. It's like, okay, I don't even know that eradicating rats is like exactly the right thing to do, or eradicating every non-native animal on New Zealand, like they're trying to get rid of all the predators right now. It's like, I don't know that that's exactly the right thing to do, but if you're going to do it, how about we use some genetic control? Like, we've got this awesome technology, like let's figure out how to implement it. Let's put it out there. It's an island. We can like make a really good plan for doing it safely. Maybe we're not going to be ready to do it tomorrow, but like, let's think really critically about how we could do it, because I have to imagine that gradually like dying out because you live a full life and just don't happen to reproduce is a lot better than being killed, you know, immediately by poison or being shot. So like, let's at least try to accomplish some conservation outcomes in as high welfare a way as we can.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, Michelle, I think you've been overly generous with your time. We're so grateful for your time and you know, the really great knowledge that you've given us, and questions that I think you've got everyone thinking about, because this isn't something that we cover in our fellowship, and I think it's sort of pretty left of field even for EA, which is a special accomplishment. So thank you so much.
Oh yeah, no problem. It was really fun. I love talking about it. So appreciate all the questions. Thank you guys all for being here.
Awesome. Thanks everyone. See you next week.
Next week. Bye, Michelle.
Bye.